Hello and welcome to a foreign policy virtual dialogue exploring one of the world's biggest problems today, how illicit funds and corruption are contributing to democratic backsliding. Today, we're going to discuss what can be done about it. My name is Ravi Agrawal and I'm FP's editor-in-chief. It's my pleasure to be your host this morning. Now, exactly 1 month ago today, on February 24th, Russia invaded Ukraine. As the world watched national medias react to this horrific, brutal war, many are also wondering how we got here. This is, after all, Putin's war in Putin's Russia with Putin's propaganda. And given the extent of global sanctions, there is little chance such a move would take place in a democracy. There's also little doubt that Putin's autocracy is significantly bolstered by illicit finance, not only in Russia, but around the world. What I'm saying isn't new. This is a global problem. It is an old problem, but we're looking at it with renewed urgency. At US President Joe Biden's Democracy Summit last year, and also at the new US, UK, EU Interparliamentary Alliance Against Kleptocracy, there have been several calls now to bolster democracy. Today, we're assembling some great experts to drill down on what more governments, organizations, journalists, and others can do to safeguard democracy and more effectively combat corruption. All of that's coming up. A big thanks to the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFES, for helping us make this event possible. Before we get started, just want to make sure we can hear from you, our audience. We have many hundreds of people tuned in here on Zoom and many more thousands watching our live streams on social media. We've reserved a portion of this event for questions from our global audience. Here's how to write in. If you're on Zoom, click on the Q&A button below and submit your questions. Tell us your name, organization, and where you're writing in from. If you're watching us on the phone or watching the live stream, you can email us. The address for that is events@foreignpolicy.com. Of course, we encourage you to chime in on social media as well. Be sure to use the hashtag #OpaquePolitics. Okay, so let's get started. Earlier this week, I sat down with Bill Browder, the CEO of Hermitage Capital, which advised the largest foreign investment fund in Russia until 2005, when Bill was denied entrance into Russia after being deemed a threat to national security. When Browder's lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, tried to defend him, he was arrested, tortured, and later killed while he was in custody. Since then, Browder has been working to lobby the US government to sanction Russia for human rights violations linked to Magnitsky's death. There are few others in the world who are as familiar with the nuts and bolts of sanctioning Russia as Bill Browder, given how much that topic is now in the news and how it's connected to the larger issues we want to discuss today. I began our interview with Bill by asking him just how much he thought Russia was suffering from the West's sanctions right now. Listen in.
I think they're suffering intensely. So you have a situation where Russians can no longer take out more money than $10,000 out of their bank account, no matter how much is in their bank account. They have they can't use credit cards, MasterCard, Visa, Apple Pay, Google Pay, all that stuff has been canceled. They can't buy any Western goods anymore. They can't watch Netflix. The price of just about every imported good is up between 50 and 100%. This is an absolute disaster for the average Russian person.
And I guess the question in the here and now is, how does that pressure, that leverage then end up affecting potentially some of Putin's decisions? And so, again, just given your history with Russia, your history with his regime, is there anything else that the world can do in addition to what have so far been seismic sanctions economically in such a way that the costs of war become too high for Putin, or is that a pipe dream?
No, not at all. The cost of war will never become too high for Putin. But what will happen is if we complete the sanctions program successfully, and there's still more work to be done, then he'll run out of money because the sanctions are so all-encompassing. And that's the purpose. I don't think at this point we're trying to change his mind. We could have changed his mind if we had been more consistent in our approach towards his horrible actions in the past. If we had done something after he invaded Georgia, if we had done something after he took Crimea, after poisoning in the Salisbury poisonings, all these things, if we had done something then, he might have thought we would do something now, and then might have had a different calculation before he made the decision to go in. Once he made the decision to go in, Putin is a guy who doesn't have a reverse gear. He doesn't back up. And so at this point, our main objective, and the only realistic objective, is to completely and absolutely starve him of resources, so that this expensive war that he's raging, he runs out of money. And that's feasible based on the current sanctions that have been levied, but it requires probably a little bit more complete set of sanctions. We need to sanction the top 100 oligarchs, not just a dozen of the top oligarchs. We need to disconnect 100% of the Russian banks from SWIFT, not just 70%. And we need to get our European allies to reduce, and in some cases eliminate, the purchase of Russian oil and gas. And that's not an overnight exercise, but that's something that would really, truly devastate Vladimir Putin and starve him of resources.
Indeed. And the sad reality of all of this is that all of these measures will take time. That, of course, is not time that Ukrainian citizens have, so many of whom have left Ukraine, many more have died. And of course, we wait to see how that war plays out in the next few weeks and months. So, Bill, I did want to begin with Russia, and we've done that. But obviously, we're here today to discuss a broader issue. Putin's war in Ukraine is a reminder, if we ever needed one, about the importance of democracy, as opposed to an autocratic regime that can decide whatever it wants with impunity. And there's a connection between corruption and unjust power systems. Talk us through that a little bit, if you will.
Well, let's use Putin as the case study. So Putin, he didn't go into government to serve the Russian people. He went into government to steal money, and he's in a quote democracy where he and his cronies are stealing, like, literally most of the resources from the state. And so what happens in that scenario is that if anyone were to know that they stole the money, they wouldn't vote for them. So he's got to change the whole voting system so that anybody who's running against him for president gets eliminated, either murdered like Boris Nemtsov, imprisoned like Alexei Navalny, or exiled like Garry Kasparov. He's got to then crack down on all sources of information for the public by going after journalists, imprisoning and killing journalists. And as time goes on and he's stolen more and more money, and he's more and more worried about being overthrown, what does he do? He starts a war. He did this with Georgia. He did this with Crimea, and now he's doing it with the overall country of Ukraine. And so everything about kleptocracy, corruption, and lack of democracy all sort of feeds into this same thing, which is it ends up leading to terrible violence, both against the Ukrainian people and also terrible repression against his own people.
Indeed. So I guess the obvious question then, Bill, is what can we do? What tangible steps can countries take to fight illicit financial flows, other than exposing them, as you point out? But what else can they do?
Well, and one thing we can do is not aid them in their kleptocracy. So in order to export his corruption from Russia, he needs to have somebody import it in the West. And so there's a whole willing and able cadre of Western enablers all on standby, ready to help Vladimir Putin and crooks from other dictatorships. And we have it dramatically in London, and there are people like this in New York and all over Europe. And
give us a few examples of what you're describing.
Well, you have law firms in London which are in the business of helping these Russian crooks set up structures and trusts and offshore companies and all sorts of agreements to shield and hide and protect their dirty money. They're the money laundering law firms. And then the same firms or different firms are the reputation laundering firms. And so as anytime somebody says something bad or exposes the truth about these oligarchs or corrupt officials, that person who says something bad, a journalist or an activist, will get a nasty letter from a law firm that's doing reputation laundering, threatening libel suits. And in some cases, those libel suits are then launched, which then bankrupt a journalist or a small media organization. So everybody's afraid to say anything. And then you have law firms and private investigation firms, which then go around and surveil and intimidate activists and opposition people in London and elsewhere who have the nerve to stand up to these people. And so there's a whole, this whole industry of these people to protect the oligarchs from ever being exposed or face justice.
And of course, this is so much broader than just Russia. If you look at other countries that have investments in real estate, we haven't talked about that, or political pressure or lobbying in many of the world's capitals that then end up influencing politics. And it's a slippery slope because then, even sort of democracies end up being hand in glove with autocracies or autocratic leaders or people who are incentivized for democratic outcomes to not happen in the same way. What's your sense of the best measures, again, other than discussions like this, other than exposing? What are the best ways of clamping down on those kinds of arrangements?
Well, I believe that if anybody has been involved in assisting these Russians in money laundering, that they should also be prosecuted in the West. And part of the problem is that we have a very non-robust law enforcement in most countries, and all these people are allowed to do this without any consequence. But, these enablers sort of blow with the wind. If you, they love money, and if there's some good money coming from the oligarchs, they would take it. But if all of a sudden the authorities in the West are breathing down their neck and prosecuting a few people, they would all quickly, abandon and even expose their oligarch clients to save their own skin. And so I think that there needs to be more of these types of investigations to expose and potentially put these enablers at risk legally.
And what's stopping that from happening? Why hasn't it happened already?
Well, at different countries, different reasons, but for the most part, it's just harder for law enforcement authorities to prosecute economic crimes, particularly economic crimes where somebody is going to be standing up and vociferously defending themselves. And so it's easy to go after someone who's stolen 4 loaves of bread. But if you go after a Russian oligarch or a lawyer assisting an oligarch, then it's complicated prosecution, and those cases are very rarely brought. And when they are brought, sometimes they don't work out exactly how the prosecutors want them to, and so they don't want to take the risk in future cases.
Bill, you and I spoke first maybe about a decade ago, I remember, and you've been, so out there for so long now, describing corruption in Russia, describing anti-democratic measures there. I just want to end by asking you this: are even you surprised by the last month?
I'm surprised in a lot of different ways by the last month. I'm surprised that Putin did this. Putin has always been keeping one foot in the civilized world and one foot in the criminal world. And so, there's always been in the past a plausibly deniable explanation. Those people in Crimea, they were Russian tourists. They're not Russian soldiers. That hack on the U.S. election wasn't us. Must have been some kid in his bedroom in parents' bedroom in New Jersey, kind of thing. Putin has never actually gone full frontal, non-deniable invasion. And so that has definitely surprised me. The other thing that surprised me is the West's reaction. The West has never done anything serious in terms of sanctions, and now the West is going really with every bit they've got on every angle of Russia. And I think it's really going to it's already having a big impact, and I think it'll continue to have a big impact.
That was Bill Browder there, the CEO of Hermitage Capital, talking about the role that corruption plays in eroding democracy, of course, with an emphasis on Russia, given the current moment that we're now in. Thank you to Bill for joining me earlier this week for that conversation. Time for our live guests now. I want to explore the role that various countries, companies, and the press can play in preventing further democratic backsliding. And I have a terrific panel for that. Joining me now, Catherine Elena is the director of the Center for Anti-Corruption and Democratic Trust at IFES. Catherine works with nations to recognize the fundamental role free and fair elections play in protecting democratic countries from political corruption. Justyna Gudzowska is the director of illicit finance policy at the Sentry. She's worked for decades to identify and prevent illicit funds influencing international systems. Michael Johnston is a professor of political science emeritus at Colgate University. He's a leading academic voice on the study of corruption, working in this area for more than 3 decades. And finally, Miranda Petruchik, Deputy Editor-in-Chief at the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. Miranda works to expose illicit financing and corruption around the world. Welcome, all of you. Okay, let's get started. I see you all. I'm going to kick things off with Catherine. And I just want to ask you to frame this for us a little bit. You heard from Bill there earlier, but more broadly, outside of what he was talking about, from your perspective, what do you think are the major factors that currently contribute to democratic backsliding?
Well, thank you, Ravi, and thank you, Foreign Policy, for joining us in this event. It's a huge question to frame things, but there was an interesting article in the Fulcrum yesterday saying that democracy is a victim of indifference. And I'd say that's only partly true because it makes it seem like backsliding is something like a passive phenomenon, just that we're not taking care of democracy, which I think is true. But I think there's also ongoing deliberate processes to undermine democracy. So I actually prefer to talk about de-democratization rather than backsliding because it's much more active.
Active, yeah. It's a good way of framing it.
Right. So I think we see everything from sort of stealth erosion of democracy to, of course, blatant dismantling of democratic institutions. And it's a quote that I love from the former head of the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala. And he called illicit financing in elections basically the original sin of democracy. And I certainly see it that way because if the consent of the governed, so all of us, which is established through credible elections, if that just becomes a currency that can be devalued or it can be manipulated, then the foundations of your democracy are going to either erode or outright collapse. So for me, that's a core cause of de-democratization and this sort of original sin that we need to address.
That's a really good point, using the active voice instead of the passive voice, because if there is de-democratization, it is deliberate. Michael, let me bring you in. And as I put my question to you, I just want to remind our viewers around the world that we do want to hear from you. I'm going to take some of your questions. I can see many of them coming in already. I do want to make one thing clear, though. We're not here to talk about what's going to happen next in Ukraine. So I urge everyone to write in more, keeping in mind that what we're hoping to do here today is to examine more the role of illicit finance in de-democratization. I'm going to start using that phrase. And what we can do about it. So, Michael, let's bring you in.
Thank you.
Give us a sense, given your work and your background, how opaque sort of campaign finance laws have increased corruption and exacerbated these de-democratization trends that we're discussing here today.
Well, money is what makes politics go, and in many, many places, we just don't have any access to knowledge about where money is coming from. In the United States, where the notion of transparency in these things first took hold, we now have massive gaps in the information that's available to people. What Jane Mayer and others have called dark money is a big part of the puzzle. Now, corruption and democratic decay both revolve around imbalances of power, the ability of some people to exploit exploit others. And the campaign finance, political money piece of it is central to that. If you ask people in the United States, you get 70% plus majorities agreeing that big money contributors have pushed people like me, people like ordinary citizens, out of the process, out of decisions in which they are really entitled to have a say. The so-called populists, the anti-democratic parties, the anti-system parties are capitalizing upon that sense of exclusion, and the anti-corruption, what used to be a movement is now an anti-corruption industry, needs to be more aggressive on that issue of exclusion, on that issue of an inclusive style of government. The anti-corruption industry needs to be less self-protective and more willing to address this situation in which many, many people feel they simply have no say. They don't have a role even in established democracies. In struggling democracies, of course, the situation is ever so much more tenuous.
Indeed. Justina, let me bring you in on this as well, just to build on what Michael was saying and the work that you do. Are there any examples of places, countries that have been able to put in place campaign finance laws, perhaps, that can clean up some of the democratic decay that we see that is so inextricably linked to money? Justina.
Hi, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So really from our perspective on the countries we work on, which are mainly in Central and Eastern Africa, unfortunately, they haven't progressed to the point of really having campaign finance laws. I think, one of the things we really advocate for is free and fair elections, in addition to dismantling the kleptocratic system. So I think when we look at our countries, Sudan, South Sudan, DRC, what we're really seeing, the problem is that these entrenched kleptocracies are very difficult to dismantle because they've really become entrenched, and the consecutive elections are maybe putting new people in power, but those same networks stay in place. And it's really the illicit money that is the backbone of those networks, because it's simply just too profitable for them to have kind of reforms and reform the system.
Miranda, let's bring you in as well now. I'm curious about the role that journalism plays in tackling and tracking illicit finance. Talk us through a little bit of what you've seen there and how that's impacting things. Miranda, you're on mute. We would have to say this at least once, so here we go.
Thank you very much for having me. In the recent years, journalism has really stepped up in its role, and a part of it is that we have become, in a way, a global family and a global network of reporters who are basically, in a way, fighting corruption, I will say. And I think the projects like Panama Papers, like Azerbaijani laundromat, like Russian laundromats, have really shown what power journalism have in basically uncovering illicit finance. And what we've seen is that, as never before, we have more tools, more resources, and basically more ways to investigate corruption. And, I'll just give one example. Most recently, as we've seen sanctions of the Russian oligarchs, a group of journalists has come together, and we have literally within, a month, put together a whole project tracking assets of oligarchs that haven't been actually sanctioned. And we have uncovered some assets that, were not known before. And I think it really shows what kind of the strength the journalists have, and this idea that it takes a network to fight a network.
Miranda, just staying with that, it must be frustrating as well that, the toolkit exists. I mean, if you look at the speed with which sanctions were unveiled over the last month, it kind of reminds you that the ways and means are there, but sometimes it's not the will, sometimes it's not the ability to actually do things.
That's very much true. And we have seen it's not just that there's no will, there's a gain in a way. And we have seen that, for example, we talk about banks facilitating money laundering, but we also know that when the banks are fine, it's just a fraction of the money that they earn, basically facilitating money laundering. So there is no deterrent to prevent these enablers and players in this global system facilitating illicit flows to basically stop doing what they're doing. And there needs to be, and I think that many people in power basically benefit from the system, which is the reason why the system is not changed.
Indeed. And what that does, of course, is it sort of breaks down trust eventually in a system when I think average citizens like all of us can see that it's so easy to launder illicit money and then whitewash reputations, as Bill was talking about earlier. As I said earlier, the problems are familiar to most people who are going to be watching this. It's important to list them. It's important to know them. But let's now transition a little bit towards solutions. Catherine, I'll bring you back in. Give us a sense, and I'm going to put variants of this question to everyone, but give us a sense of how global organizations can work together with countries to fortify democratic systems and help prevent illicit money from sloshing around the system.
Well, again, that's a big question. And I wish I could say that there's a silver bullet, but obviously there isn't. Particularly when it comes to public trust, I think it's very hard won and very easily lost. So there's a lot of long, hard work to do. When we do talk about campaign finance, and, you asked Justina about some of the campaign finance laws in Africa, I think when we talk about it, people's eyes start to glaze over. But I think that's a fundamental place to start at both the national and international level, because ultimately money is connected to influence, and those connections and those networks that Miranda talked about, they start in elections. And again, as Justina said, elections happen everywhere now. Autocrats use them to, legitimize their rule. So we need frameworks at both the national level and the international level that target a range of things. So not just opaque money and transparency, though that's needed, but we also need laws and rules that can stop illicit money flowing, and not just money in terms of where it's coming from, but where it's going. So I'm interested in making sure my representative is not influenced, let's say, by foreign money from overseas, but I'm also interested in making sure that illicit money is not invested in inauthentic content online, which ultimately might influence me or other voters. So we need a really solid framework, and then basically we need enforcement. I think Bill Browder touched on this. We can have perfect laws everywhere, but if we don't have the networks, like Miranda talked about, to enforce all of these at the national and international level, then I think we're not going to move very far or move the needle.
Yeah, but some of this is chicken and egg, because the weaker a democratic system, the less likely it is to put in place measures that would clamp down on not only the procurement of illicit finance, but also where it gets used next and how it continues to slosh through a system. Michael, let's bring you back in. What's your sense of, having heard what Catherine just said, can you expand on ways in which countries need to think about this problem differently? Is there anything that you've seen that has worked well?
I want to underline something that Catherine said about how elections are everywhere, and a lot of places go through the motions, and yet the results are directly contrary to what we would all like to see. I think we place too much faith in transparency by itself. For transparency to work, you need someone out there to use what is revealed and who has an interest in putting that information to work. And that means organizing interest groups and citizens and so forth. And in that, the anti-corruption industry has too often portrayed reform as a public good. Let's fight corruption. Everybody's better off. Well, that's a classic collective action dilemma. Linking reform to better quality services, fairer treatment by officials, having someone at your community health clinic when you go into to get help. Those are the kinds of things that mobilize self-interest. And so we need, in that sense, to be reforming both democracy and corruption. with people and instead of for people. And in that sense, there's a kind of a change of thinking in the anti-corruption movement that definitely needs to take place.
Sorry, this time I put myself on mute. Justina, let's bring you in. Can you expand on that?
Sure. I think, as was said before, it's, we can have great laws in place, but if there's a kleptocratic system in power, those laws will not be enforced. So writing great laws is not enough. And we have seen this over and over again around the world if there isn't this accountability and enforcement. And I think I'd be remiss, having just watched Bill Browder speak, to also say that there is a range of financial pressure tools available out there when the laws are not enforced domestically. And those tools, including sanctions, advisories, working with the private sector, are really a critical way to pressure those in power to give the global community leverage with those in power to change their ways. And we have really seen targeted network sanctions under Global Magnitsky, which Bill Browder, was really the lightning rod behind that whole process. Work when they're targeted properly, when they target the cronies of those in power, then we have seen them work, and those in power have changed their ways. One great example we often talk about is in the DRC. There was a problem with elections being delayed in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The leader, the very corrupt leader in power, would not step down. And there was a very concerted effort at sanctions, at financial pressure, at diplomatic means. And it did result him in stepping down and not running for re-election. So I think there is a big opportunity with financial pressure tools. And it's really an opportunity, as Bill Browder said, that was missed in Russia that we really don't want to miss again, especially when we look at certain countries that are now aligning themselves in Russia and could be lifelines for Russia.
Miranda, talk us through, again, given what you do, the role of trust in all of this, because so much of the problem we see is a breakdown of public trust in democratic systems. Some of that is because of mis and disinformation. Some of it is because you can see that illicit money is being used and that discourages people. What can be done to combat that side of things, the disheartening element of what happens here?
Oh, I'm going to start by saying, a typical thing for, the way that autocrats work is that they slowly destroy democracy by first taking control of the judiciary, by taking control of the police, and then taking control of the media. And what it means is that the people in the country see that there's no justice, because you will have a police officer who asks for $30 bribe, get 3 years prison sentence, while somebody who steals million basically walks free. So you see that in one end, and on the other end, you're basically fed lies to the point that you don't know what truth is anymore. And we can see this in Russia, where many even family members, families who have family members in Ukraine don't believe that situation is in Ukraine is as it is. They don't believe people are being killed. And it's, we have generations of brainwashed people who will not believe the truth. So what can we do in this kind of situation? And what we often fail to do is we don't try to promote transparency. And, when we talk about aid money, very often it's connected with the taxes, very often it's connected with, changes in financial system, but not with promoting a greater transparency, not with promoting access to information. And very often what gets cut first in the countries leading, in the anti-democratic movement is basically they cut you off from access to information and basically being able to see what the government is doing and report about what government is doing. And then what we have all forgotten in these countries is basically accountability. Because if you don't have the accountability, no matter what you do, it basically it becomes forgiven to you. You're allowed to do it. People feel empowered and enabled to continue doing it. And we need to promote the greater accountability.
That's so true, because when people feel that there's no accountability, they act with impunity. And I think that's when regular citizens truly turn away from the system, and then you don't have a democracy anymore. Let's take some viewer questions. One of the things that I appreciate so much about these events at FP is that our viewers from around the world are so smart and have such thoughtful questions. So, Catherine, I'll put this first one to you. Lane Mears from USAID in Zimbabwe asks, what effective leverage do international actors have to bring change in kleptocratic or captured states in which there is no political will to change?
Gosh, I feel like all the hard questions are coming my way, Ravi, but it's a great one, especially from Zimbabwe. And I think the first thing I would say is, of course, international actors can't do it on their own. And I think Michael had made a comment about collective action and the role that different parts of society, whether it's private sector, civil society, the media, when they join forces and are properly connected, they can really make a change in society. And, you know, just as I was listening to the panel, I was thinking about Ukraine and the fact that several months ago, it was actually in the democratizing trajectory, not the de-democratizing like almost every other country where we're working. And in large part, if you visited there, it was because the civil society, the independent journalists, the government, they'd gone through the revolution together. They were connected towards a common goal. So generating those almost networks of integrity in a country is, and supporting them properly is fundamental. And then internationally, I think, you know, Justina talked about sort of the financial levers, and I think those are key so that you're essentially pushing the domestic and the international levers at the same time to eventually get to some kind of tipping point.
Fascinating. A couple of comments from our viewers. Stephen Shore asks if there's any reason why properties bought in New York and London by shell companies, shell entities cannot be confiscated. I'm just putting that out there. If any of you have thoughts on that. Antona Maru writes that laundering standards are an effective tool to combat illicit financial flows and corruption. This tool needs to be promoted well throughout the world to effectively combat all kinds of crimes. And then let's bring in a question. This one's from an anonymous attendee. Justina, I'll come to you with this. Michael, also feel free to jump in. And the question is, isn't the solution that we must elect politicians who are free of special interests and special interest money, big money, corporate money, dark money? Isn't that the solution? And can't we work together to free them from that system? That's actually not anonymous. It's Dawn from California. Anyone, Justina?
Sure. I mean, I think that's obviously very, very important, who is at the top, and that there is faith in the system. There's faith in our leaders, that there isn't special interest money behind them, and that our institutions are accountable to a democratically elected government free of special interests. But that's really just one piece of the puzzle. The really other critical piece of the puzzle is that the institutions are reformed as well. It cannot be just about a change in leadership. We have seen so many times over and over again in countries such as Sudan, where you have a change with leadership at the top and a coup happens. And why has the coup happened? Because the entrenched interests stayed in place. The entrenched kleptocratic system was not changed because and it was just too profitable not to have a coup. So I think we can't just look at the leadership at the top. We need to look at the whole system and make sure that system is also free of special interests.
And I guess the question, as always, is, but how? Let me throw this out to all of you. Michael, I see you're about to jump in. Before you do that, just a comment from another viewer, Nathan Brockwood, who points out that this is a depressing discussion, and he's not wrong. And he's pushing us to cite an example where any of these measures to shore up democratization have made progress? I'm just going to put that out there, but Michael, out to you.
Well, I think the previous question stated a fine ideal. The trouble is with the term special interest, and that is, my people and I are fine, upstanding citizens. You people are a special interest. That term is a kind of an elastic meaning.
Right.
And I think the key is really to broaden the range of interests that get involved and to make the process as inclusive as possible, so as many voices as possible are heard. Where I live now in the state of Texas, there's oil and gas, and then there's gas and oil, and really that's about the whole story of politics, and the issue is inclusivity. So, in a democracy, you want self-interested participation, but you want to broaden it, and I think that's something that we have often tended to ignore.
Are there any solutions such as direct democracy or citizens' assemblies that could help? Let me just put that out there. Catherine, Justina, Michael, or Miranda, if you want to chime in.
Sure, I might make one comment on the previous discussion too, just about electing politicians that aren't connected to special interests. I think one challenge to all of that at present is polarization in society. So no matter how much I see that one politician is clean and the other is not, I hate this politician because the polarization and the narrative and the influence on social media has made it impossible for me to break my party or to go in a different way. So addressing that polarization is really important. And I think one comment I wanted to make is we have to connect all these different areas, the strengthening of the institutions, the media, the civil society, the polarization. If you're focusing on one, you're going to end up with one sort of weak leg at the table. Just in terms of depressing, I mean, we have to acknowledge how depressing it is because that makes us care about it, I think. But there are bright spots. And again, I think I just touched on one being Ukraine. And again, having just been out there in November and seeing how connected and motivated and passionate Ukrainians were to make their democracy have both normative and functional values. So they really were focusing on democracy for being free, and protecting individual rights, but also on functioning and delivering for citizens. And, they were at the forefront of new e-governance. I'm not saying were, they are at the forefront of, innovations in e-governance and making it easier for individual citizens to access services without, having to pay a bribe. So focusing, having society focusing on those two precious elements of democracy, I think is really key, and examples do exist.
Well, let's see if we can talk about some of those examples. And Miranda, let me bring you in. Are we in the media not doing a good enough job of highlighting some of those examples?
Well, I actually wanted to bring up examples of Slovakia, which is a country in the European Union. But if you guys remember, just a few years ago, Jan Kuciak, a young reporter from Slovakia, was killed exactly for reporting on corruption. And, what came out of his death is that, reporters got insight in how, a powerful local oligarch was basically controlling judiciary, blackmailing judges and police officials. And what resulted from this reporting and people going out on streets and protesting is basically a change of government and change in the system, really, because many of those corrupt judges have been fired and, the man responsible has been arrested and was on trial. So I think that shows that, with the information, the people can get awakened, and they can go out in the street and basically change a future of the country. In this case, Slovakia was going into very dark, space, and it actually became a light. So that's one of the example. And, and I want to say is, as a journalist, we often, or get asked like, okay, you published a story, you worked on it for a year, there was no change, or, the government didn't change. But I have to say that there is a change, and very often those changes are small and incremental, but ultimately they do make a difference. And I think this is something where, we might not have a big change right away, but we need to start working on the smaller changes.
Let me put this to Justine and Catherine. In a lot of countries around the world, and I see this as a journalist, there's a connection between anti-corruption movements and populism. And the reason why I bring this up is sometimes the two get mired, and sometimes people end up, obviously anti-corruption as a slogan is very popular in many elections in countries around the world. But it's often described in the wrong way. And then sometimes parties and governments get elected, which actually end up making things worse, even as they talk about getting rid of, the big urban fat cats when, corruption can exist in many forms and many styles. Catherine, I see you nodding, so I'll let you take that one.
Well, I was just thinking you're taking us back into depressing territory, Ravi, but it's absolutely true. I mean, we just see it now as yet another tool of that de-democratization. So it's a great campaign strategy and campaign slogan, and then you get in power and you can use that power to lock up your opposition by calling them kind of corrupt and everything else. So again, I think we're just seeing it now as yet another tool of manipulation, and one that has to be tackled again in that holistic way I was talking about. So strengthening all the legs of the table, including, of course, public civic education, media, to understand where one certain narrative that they might be hearing is not the reality, kind of under the water, I guess.
Justina, what other measures would you like this audience here today to consider and think about in terms of, improving some of these outcomes we're describing, in terms of making sure that people realize the role that illicit money plays and how to stop it?
I would just add, pay attention, stay informed, read as much as you can, because I feel like for us that are really in this world, we are very much aware of what's going on. We're aware of the illicit money, we're aware of corruption, but doing the job I do, when I talk to, even my parents or my friends, they just have no idea. And when I'll say, have you heard about this oligarch buying X property? And they're like, really? That's crazy. I didn't know about it. I think, for the audience here, read, and talk to your Congress people, get out there and support civil society, support free media, support local civil society, very importantly, because without local civil society, without some of these people that are risking their lives to really bring, let us, to really open our eyes, we would not know half of what we know. So, support people like Miranda and her organization.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And you mentioned the word community. That's so important as well, because one of the trends of the last 30 or 40 years, alongside democratization after the fall of the Berlin Wall, is urbanization, the rise of technology, forces that lead people to leave home, and thereby weakening especially rural communities, which then builds in us and them. It then reduces trust eventually in world capitals and in big organizations and in media organizations like ours. And it's important for all of us, I think, to consider those factors and think of ways in which that we can appeal more to regular people all over the world, but also build trust in our institutions. Miranda, let me bring you back in on that. What can the media do more of to try and sort of bridge divides between urban, rural, rich, poor, between left, right? We're polarized not only in America, but in so many countries around the world in ways that reduce trust. And the minute you have less trust, that's when anything illicit can thrive. And messages such as, believe us, we're sweeping out corruption, except we are corrupt too, those messages can thrive too.
I think on the one end, media has to report about everybody equally. I think sometimes in some places, what you see is like opposition media, which never writes about the opposition's wrongdoings. And I think media as itself, we need to, any wrongdoing is a wrongdoing, and we need to report it without standing on anybody's side. I think also we need to, make people's voices heard. And I know it sounds, like a cliche, But what often happens is, we report about these big stories about corruption and stolen money, but we don't report about how this affects people. And, very often, we say, oh, somebody stole 2 billion. What is the 2 billion for a villager in Africa? What is it for, old lady in Kyrgyzstan? So that's something we need to bring back, this notion of corruption and these big amounts, and put it at a level where people can understand. And we don't always do a good job on that. I also think we need to be more transparent about our own research, because we are asking basically people to trust us. But what we write is no different what anybody else writes, except that on one end it's true, on the other end it's fake, but the person doesn't know it. And we need to promote in a better way, sharing our documents, sharing our process, how we do this, so people can make a decision for themselves instead of just us asking them to trust what we say.
That is such great advice, and I'm going to take that to heart as well as an editor. I'm afraid that's all we have time for on this panel. Miranda Petrucik, thank you for that. Catherine Elena, Justina Gudzowska, thank you so much for your time. The three of you, I learned so much from everything you've said, and also Michael Johnston, who had to leave us a few minutes early. Thank you to the four of you for being on this panel.
Thank you.
I have one last guest who's going to help us explore more closely one missing part of the puzzle, and that is how civil society can work and cooperate with governments to inform means and methods to track illicit finance. So joining us now, Tony Banbury is president and CEO of IFIS. Before joining them in 2018, he served at the UN for 20 years, including leading the UN's first ever emergency health mission in response to the 2014 West Africa Ebola crisis. Tony, welcome.
Thank you very much, Ravi. It's great to be here. And that was a fascinating conversation that you just had with those panelists.
Oh, thank you. And it's great to have you with us as well. So, I guess on that note, let's start with that. Given what you've heard so far from this session, this conversation today, what are we missing when it comes to figuring out how best to crack down on corruption and stop that from bleeding into democracy?
As some of the panelists observed, as was present in some of the questions, this issue can be very depressing, but the reality is corruption is present in every society. It's not going to go away. It's not a problem to be solved. It's a problem to be managed. And when it's approached as a problem to be managed with lots of different tools to be applied in different contexts, I think progress can be made. And there were some great suggestions from the panelists, issues related to trust and what Miranda was saying. But the context matters a lot. Corruption in a kleptocracy like Russia is going to be very different than corruption, say, where I am today. I'm in Kenya. They're very different. And so they have to be looked at and approached differently, whether the effort to address and manage the problem is primarily driven domestically, or whether it's so far gone domestically, it's really a matter of international actors applying pressure in a domestic context to try and improve the situation. We really need to develop a broad toolbox that has some laws, that has some powers to identify what's actually happening, and then powers to prosecute and sanction. And then depending on that national context, combine the tools in an appropriate way to try and improve the situation.
It's so important what you say about national context. I think in some countries you can have small daily acts of corruption and bribery that might not get reported up but consume people's lives. In India, where I grew up, for example, we used to talk about birth to death corruption, where you have to pay a bribe to get a birth certificate for your child, and then when it's your turn to die, your child has to pay a bribe to get a death certificate for you. And of course, in some Western democracies, you don't have that problem. But then you have larger hidden corruption that can sort of come out in more pervasive ways, but as a one-off. Let me ask you this. What needs to be done in terms of how governments and other stakeholders work together to achieve some of the goals you're talking about?
I think that's a really critical issue. Given the complexities of corruption and the pervasiveness in so many societies, it's not just going to be civil society organizations or legal reform advocates or journalists. It really takes a multi-dimensional effort involving a wide range of stakeholders. In countries where it's a total kleptocracy and corruption is actually not a feature of the society, but the organizing principle of the society, of the politics, of the economics, of the legal system, there the reforms needed are not going to come from within. And I think Justina sort of referenced that in respect to Sudan. And so the role of the international community is going to be so, so important. In other societies where corruption is perhaps pervasive and highly influential, but hasn't reached the level of total kleptocracy, points that were made in your conversation with the panelists around connecting with people and demonstrating to people how corruption impacts their real life. You yourself mentioned it in your opening remarks about whether someone, oh no, I'm sorry, it was Michael, someone who wants to go to a healthcare center and isn't able to get healthcare, say, for their child because of the corruption in the system. And getting people to have understanding and a voice and then a demand and an expectation of their government is a really essential component of it. It can't just be outside organizations, say like IFES, we I think have a role to play and an important one, or the Century, Miranda's organization as well. We all have a role to play, but creating that expectation among people who have the most stake and the most power in society is absolutely essential, I think.
You know, at the end of last year, when President Biden held his Summit for Democracy, corruption and anti-corruption measures was a major part of that. Do you think measures like that help? Are there any downsides to sort of aligning democracies against autocracies in that way?
I think the summit was helpful on anti-corruption and more broadly on democracy for two main reasons. One, it put these issues at the very top of the international priority list for heads of state and heads of government. It's not something just for anti-corruption bodies or foreign assistance organizations or NGOs like IFES. There's a recognition now by leaders around the world and a commitment by leaders around the world that corruption is a problem that requires their attention and their action. And a summit, the second reason it's so important is it can be a forcing event for future action. And there's a lot of activity now taking place as a result of the summit and commitments that were made at it. And there's going to be a follow-on summit a year after the first one, where they will be reporting out on those commitments, and a lot of them around anti-corruption. And the problems of corruption certainly aren't going to be gone by the time the second summit rolls around, but all those commitments that were made, the political will reflected by heads of state and government, I think are going to contribute to improving the management of the anti-corruption problem.
I need to wrap in 60 seconds, so very quick final question to you. A, is Washington doing enough? And B, if there's one more thing you would like to see it do around, you know, combating illicit funds and campaigns, what would that be?
None of us are doing enough. That's clear, particularly in those societies where corruption really is the organizing principle. Second, if I had to answer your question, I think the thing, it's hard to really prioritize any single thing, Ravi, but what I would, if I am forced to choose, is say that we need better tools to identify where the dark and illicit money is coming and going. The bad actors are very ambitious. They're very imaginative. They have tremendous resources behind them. They're usually 2 or 3 steps ahead of us. We need to be more ambitious, more imaginative, create more capable tools, including a lot of technology-based ones, in order to not just catch up with these bad actors, but actually get ahead of them so we can really start turning the tide and pushing them back.
That is a really useful final takeaway. Better tools to get ahead on this game of whack-a-mole. Tony Banbury, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Ravi.
All right, that was Tony Banbury, their president and CEO of IFAS. Learned so much from that conversation, and indeed all of our sessions today. To all our speakers, thank you again for joining us to share your perspectives on illicit funds and the decline of democracy. A big thanks again to the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFAS, for supporting this event. And to you, our audience around the world, thank you for your very thoughtful comments and questions that helped us focus some of our discussion today. Much more to come from FP this month and next month. Join us on April 27 and 28 for our second annual Climate Summit. That's going to include 2 days of high-level programming with global leaders and trailblazers working to